Welcome to the Steven Cimino Says Boom Show, episode number 43.
Oh.
Hey everyone, welcome to Pop XP. And before the show starts, make sure to click that subscribe button and click the bell to get notifications when we go live and we upload awesome new content. And don't forget, if you can, make sure to share our stream on all your social media outlets. We appreciate it, and thanks for helping us grow the Pop XP channel.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Steven Cimino Says Boom Show. Not episode, issue. I still get those wrongs. 43 issues in. Sorry, it's the brain damage. I can't. I get excited. So now you got to keep
damage there. There's a lot of damage. A lot of damage.
Steve, would you say I need damage control?
Oh, he may be damaged, but he's pretty sharp right now.
Like attack.
The guy below us, the guy below us keeps us on the even keel. Now, Billy Tucci in spirit, tell us what's up, man.
Yes. As you know, everyone, look below, click that subscribe button, and smash that bell so you get notified when we have awesome new episodes like tonight's show, future shows, past shows. You're not going to want to miss it. So click those links. And gentlemen, I'm psyched for tonight. So what do we have going on?
Oh, Steve. We always get the best guests. And this guest that we got today, I love it. I get giddy. Like I said, I make mistakes. I get, I'm like a little kid. I can't hold things. I'm trying to drink. Water goes everywhere. I can't help it because I get excited. Why? Because I love the comic books and I love to meet and talk with the people involved. Steve, what do you have to say about today's guest that we have?
Well, again, we have been talking with a lot of creators from a certain era. That magnificent early 1970s era. And we have another guest today that is going to allow us to go into the weeds a little bit, to take a look at early 1970s Marvel bullpen. And of course, also some other stuff that people might not be aware of in regards to the independent realm. So again, me and John are going to be rolling our sleeves up and getting into that beautiful early 1970s material.
Oh yeah, and this is a guy that was hanging out in the creative juncture with Jim Starlin, our boy Steve Englehart. We've had Steve Englehart so many times like we've lost count now. I mean, it's just great. But I rank this guy. This guy is another one that I call like a Rick Hoberg. And what I mean by that is that he's done work that has touched everybody. But sometimes people don't recognize the name 100%. And then they figure out some of the things he's done and they'll be like, oh, it was him? And yes, because he was such a great talent. And this is our job to push these guys to the forefront and let everybody know. And this is a man with an incredible talent, an incredible human being, and he's looking sharp. He's looking almost as sharp as Roy Thomas. You know why? He's got a nice head of hair going on. I love it. Ladies and gentlemen, for you and for the comic lovers out there, may we introduce Mr. Michael Friedrich.
Hello.
Welcome.
Welcome.
Looking sharp. I love it. Mike, thank you. It's an honor for you to be here. You're going to get a lot of drooling and a lot of people. We're going to throw a lot of love your way because that's just the way we do it. But we're also going to come with a lot of questions. And my first question for you is obviously how did you get into this wild world of comics? Were you a fan from the beginning? Tell us the origins of Mr. Michael Friedrich.
Well, I never grew up. That's the basic answer. I started out writing letters to the editor at DC Comics, mostly the Julie Schwartz books, back when there used to be letter columns that were in the comics. And I think I started when I was about 14, and over my high school years, I had about 50 letters printed. And actually, after a couple of years, got into a correspondence with Mr. Schwartz. And my letters went from, I really like this story, to I really like this story because, to I really like this story, but it would have been better if you had done this. Why don't you let me try writing one of them? And unbeknownst to me, he was in desperate need of a new writer.
Wow.
And he said, sure, fine. I'm 17 years old. And he rejected things with criticism that focused my attention. And the third script I wrote, he bought.
Wow.
Right a month before I graduated from high school. So I took that money. I'll tell you a story. I lived in an attic. I was the oldest of 9 kids. It was a crowded house, and I lived in a converted attic. And so my mom put my mail at the bottom of the stairs, along with the clothes that she'd washed that day. And so I come home from school, and there's this thick envelope, and in the envelope is a copy of the script edited with a check for $100.
Wow.
Which he had to have done like the minute he got the script, because the turnaround time from when I had mailed it to when it came back was like 3 days, coast to coast. I'm in California. So I open this envelope and I just run up and down the stairs. I can't say a word. I just run up and down the stairs.
Oh, man.
And I've never forgotten that moment.
Oh.
So I took that money and I impulsively flew to New York. I was going to stay with Roy Thomas, tell a story about Roy. There's a longer version of that. I stop off in Detroit to stay with Shel Dorf, who I just met, and to attend a comics and science fiction convention over the weekend. And in New York, Roy calls to say, I got a friend of mine staying here now. I don't have any room for you. I went, okay. So he turned me on to Dave Kaler, who another background name in comics, who had room. And so I wound up, I didn't know Dave Kaler from Adam. I knew the name, but I had never talked to him, written a letter to him or anything. But I wound up spending my college years staying with Dave over the summer. And as time went on, I'd stayed over the Christmas and Easter breaks. And slowly I got more and more work from DC. I did a couple of stories for Marvel. And by my senior year, I was a regular writer at Justice League. And then right after college, I moved to New York full time, I thought. And 6 months in, I started working for Marvel full time.
Wow. Unbelievable. What I love
of all those stories.
Yeah, what I love is how you guys were all hanging out together too. Because I know, was Roy with Gary at that time? Or I know.
I don't remember. That's too long ago.
Yeah. Well, and then I knew Bill Everett. Yeah.
Well, right. I roomed with Bill Everett. I mean, I don't know if you knew that.
Yeah.
He knew Dave, and all three of us were jammed into the studio apartment. Bill was in his 50s at that point. His wife had died, and he had been an alcoholic most of his life, but had turned around and was rebuilding himself and getting back into comics. And he and I became really good friends as well. We wound up doing a couple of stories together even.
Now, were you a fan of reading the comics too at that time? So
well, yeah, I was mostly, strangely enough, for my career, I was mostly a DC fan.
Okay.
I was kind of aware of Marvel, but wasn't really a fan of the material. I read the books. I liked what Roy wrote more than anybody else. But until I started working there, I didn't really pay close attention.
Wow. Go ahead, Steve.
I can tell you a lot about Green Lantern and Flash and Batman.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So if you're, obviously you had a lot of experience there with DC, obviously felt very comfortable with their characters. And suddenly you're over there at Marvel. And what was the first Marvel project that you were going to have to work on?
I was handed Iron Man right away. Roy had needed a writer for that. He was trying to do it himself, but just couldn't. It was just tough on his schedule. So he was very grateful to hand it off. And I wound up being the book that was the last book I wrote for Marvel was Iron Man. So my whole Marvel writing career began and ended with Iron Man.
So how did you go about getting yourself set so that you could actually write the book? Did you have to do a crash course on reading what in the hell had been going on?
Yes, I'm afraid so.
How far did you go back before you felt you were comfortable?
Oh, maybe a year or two. It wasn't, you didn't need to have super depth. There hadn't been a lot of evolution in the Iron Man character up until that point. It was pretty much the same as from the beginning. I changed a few things up, but not dramatically. So yeah, the prep time wasn't that hard. But I started just reading tons of Marvels across the board so that I wouldn't get put in that position again.
Now you start writing Iron Man, and you're going to be forever linked with issue number 55. I know.
Right.
That's going to go on the grave with you. There's going to be on your tombstone because that you're with this young guy, Jim Starlin, and he has two characters actually that he wanted to put in there. Tell me that whole process with that, because obviously Jim Starlin was the creator.
He and I have different memories about that story.
Please tell us.
So, and I defer to his. His story sounds fine. He said he had these. It wasn't just two characters. He had 5 or 6 different characters that were all sort of formed this little universe in his head. And he says he went to Roy Thomas, and Roy, being the editor, said, well, why don't you work it out with Mike and introduce the characters in Iron Man. I have a vague memory. It's not clear. I'm not insisting that it's true, but the background is that Jim and I were housemates. We were sharing a house in Staten Island with a couple other guys. And that's where I met him. I hadn't met him before then. He was, I believe, drawing covers for Marvel. And I think he showed me the material that he had developed, and I said, well, maybe we could put this in Iron Man. Maybe I said, why don't you go talk to Roy, get permission, let's work it out in Iron Man. In any case, it happened. I mean, he developed the storyline. I mean, if you read I was very careful with the credits when I wrote that issue, because he came up with the storyline. I had no input in the storyline at all. I had no input in the creating of the characters. He did all of that. The one contribution I made was that I made the dialogue a bit more lively than his first draft.
Okay.
It took him a while to figure out so we wound up working together on those characters pretty consistently for about 6 months or a year, because he moved pretty soon after over to Captain Marvel. And I wrote the first handful of those. And again, I mean, he's plotting everything. I'm just getting finished artwork and lots of scribbles in the margins as to what's going on. And it was easy to follow. I didn't have a lot to figure out. So I worked really hard to make the characters sound interesting with their dialogue. Jim eventually figured out how to write the stuff himself, and Roy gave me another assignment, and Jim took off and has handled it ever since.
Now, when you see how large that issue has gotten, and then the characters that have come out, that you have a hand in that too. You have your thumbprint on that as well.
Yeah.
Like, what do you think, just from a perspective of doing that at the drawing board with in just that with Jim, and now all of a sudden it's known all over the world times 10. How do you feel about that?
Iron Man 55 was 1 week of work that I spent 50 something years ago. And so it's not the best thing I ever did. There are other things I'm much more proud of at Marvel and at DC. But, I mean, I have to just thank Jim Starlin's talent for it coming to the foreground. I mean, it's the fickle finger of fate.
Yeah. Wow. Go ahead,
I mean,
Steve.
I'm happy to go along for the ride. I mean, I see them, they fly me down to LA, and we do these Hollywood things when they do the movies, and I see Jim there, and I see Steve there, and I mean, Steve and I live about 5 miles apart, and we get together at least once or twice a year.
Oh, good, Steve.
So after you finished your work on Captain Marvel, where did you head to next, and what was your feeling about where your career was going at Marvel at that time? Were you satisfied? Were you happy, or were you trying to strive for something else?
Well, if you're prepping Star Reach, I didn't have the idea yet. Working for Marvel was different from working for DC. When I worked for DC, I'm working on these characters that were my childhood favorites. I really enjoyed the work. I enjoyed the characters. I had editorial issues in the background, personality issues in the background, but that didn't interfere with my enjoyment of the material. Working for Marvel was more of a job. It was an enjoyable job. I enjoyed working on the characters. It was a much more comfortable and creative working environment. It was the flip side of working at DC at the time, was that the working environment was much more fun. I had a much happier time working on the characters, but I wasn't as attached viscerally to the characters.
Mm-hmm.
So how I felt about individual assignments varied depending on which characters they were. I'm afraid I don't remember which one came up after Captain Marvel. I probably was Kazar, but you guys would know better than I would. Look at the publication dates and figure it out. I mean, I'll tell you over time, I mean, I was not somebody hanging out in the bullpen. I enjoyed Marvel, but I was a Californian and didn't like living in New York. and I missed my family, and so after a year of being in New York, I was the first writer to live out of town. They had artists living out of town at the time, but I showed them that I could turn in the scripts and get them there, whether I was in Staten Island, which, as far as Manhattan was concerned, was 2 hours out of town to begin with. So I started mailing stuff in from Staten Island just to show that if I put stuff in the mail, make it overnight mail, they'll get it. Everything's fine. I don't have to physically take it in. Now they had learned to do this with many of the artists. Jack Kirby, of course, had been doing this for years from Southern California. So they were hesitant, but agreed to let me come back here to the Bay Area, and I started sending stuff out. The reverse happened. I started talking up how you could work for Marvel working from California, and so that's why Steve Englehart lives 5 miles away from me.
Yeah.
Jim Starlin came out. The bullpen moved west. We had a bullpen west for quite a while. Tom Warzikowski, Steve Lealoa, who else? There was one or two others. Alan Weiss was out here for a little while. But Steve and Jim were the mainstays. Frank Brunner, that's another one that was out here.
Yes, I think we actually, on one of Steve Englehart's show, we had a photo, I think. We had a photo of that little group.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
We would get together quite often. I mean, we socialized with each other quite a bit.
Wow. Go ahead now.
Now, I personally am a huge fan of independent comics and self-publishing, and you did. You created Star Reach, which was, to me, at like a forefront for self-publishers today. Is just is an ideal book and motivation for getting it out there. Can you tell us, really the birth of Star Reach and going off on your own?
Sure. Now, at some point, and I got to be a little dissatisfied with the characters I was being given at Marvel, but it was incremental. It wasn't like I had a blow up or anything like that. Jim Starlin was famous for quitting on a spur of a moment.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
He quit Marvel. He quit DC at least a dozen times. What I've drifted away. I did leave DC on a particular day, but I drifted away from Marvel. It took 2 years from the idea of Star Reach to the actual first issue. I was inspired by what Jim Steranko had done. I was inspired by what Wally Wood had done. And I didn't think of it as a career move. I just thought it would be a fun project to do. And the first thing I remember talking about was working with Roy Thomas and Barry Smith on a Robert E. Howard character called Bran McMorn. That Roy had the rights. Roy was having a problem with Marvel at the time. And for some reason, Barry drew like 10 pages or 12 pages and then stopped. And I don't remember, I didn't know Barry at that time very well at all. And so after about a year, Roy had mended his fences with Marvel and and they now had these black and white magazines. And so they did a Robert E. Howard magazine, and Roy hired Tim Conrad to work in a comparable style to Barry Smith so that it would be visually relatively seamless. And Tim finished the story and it was published by Marvel. But by now, so a year and a half has gone by. I have this idea in my head that I'd really like to do this. And I'm staying with Jim Starlin in Hell's Kitchen in New York. And I say, is there anything you want to do that doesn't fit at Marvel? And he had these death-related characters. And here again, I don't remember precisely. Either Jim suggested or I knew Howard Chaykin from working with Howard off and on, although nothing ever got into print, but he was part of my social group. But I remember going from Manhattan out to Queens where Howard lived and talking to him, and he had this Cody Starbuck character. So the two of them said, yeah, we'll do it. And at the last minute, I said, I want to make this 48 pages, not 32 pages. And they said, well, we know this guy that just showed up in town, and he did this student project up in Rhode Island. His name is Walter Simonson. Yeah. And so I got this Walter Simonson story at the last minute, and that's how the first issue came together. And once I did it, I knew that this was something I wanted to do more of. And so it took me a couple of years, maybe a year and a half to 2 years before I was doing enough regular Star Reach work that I could afford to stop writing and just shift totally into publishing.
Wow, that's awesome. It's great that I love how the things happen. Like you are with such a creative group and all that. Mike, I want to take it back to Marvel for a second, because you are actually going to be the writer of Giant Size X-Men #1. Roy had you originally on there to be that scripter, and then Roy leaves at that time. Len Wein moves in. Len Wein takes over. Already the idea is already there, and then Len and Dave come up with the newer characters and all that stuff. But already that plot and all that stuff was already designed. I know from Roy from the meeting with Stan and the other guys there. But you were supposed to write it. Can you tell me about that whole thing, and then you getting pushed out? I just always wanted to know that from your perspective.
Well, I don't have a long story about that. I had met Dave Cockrum over at DC. Actually, the first day he showed up at DC, I happened to be there at the office and met him out in the lobby. He was just out of the military. I forget. I think it was the Navy. I don't remember for sure. But he'd been coming from California, and so that was a connection. And he was not somebody I was close to, but I would run into him periodically. And at some point, he showed me what he thought of as the new Blackhawks. And he showed it to DC, and he couldn't sell it as the new Blackhawks. But he must have shown it to Roy, I remember saying, well, let me introduce you to Roy Thomas over at Marvel. And I have a very, very clear memory of introducing Roy and Steve at a restaurant in the General Motors building that was called Cars, and where the motif was that you sat inside of a car and ate lunch. And it doesn't exist anymore, long gone. But Roy was impressed with it, said, well, we could make it the X-Men instead of the Blackhawks. Let me go talk to Stan. And that's the last I knew about it. Roy left not too long after. Len came along, and at some point, somebody told me, whether it was Len himself, I don't remember, but Len assigned himself the script and worked with Dave on the first issue. So I had no creative input on the first issue at all.
Oh,
but,
yeah,
I do take credit for making an introduction between Dave and Roy. So in essence, between Dave and Marvel.
Yeah, wow. I always wanted to know that. Go ahead, Steve.
I want to get back to the actual nuts and bolts of the Star Reach, because I was an avid reader of the Marvel Comics Index back in the day, George Olszewski. And he would always do these little editorials explaining the horrors of printers, trying to get stuff done. He said it was an absolute nightmare. So obviously, you have some creators, you have some art, but I can't imagine that you were fully experienced in like calling people up and saying, okay, I want to get 48 pages printed. How much is it going to cost? How did that come to be? And who were you? Someone must have helped you on that front.
Well, somehow or other, and I've forgotten how I was introduced to a guy who made his living as a print broker, and he took this to a printer and brought me back a piece of shit, which I rejected. I mean, you couldn't, it was blobs of ink. There was no artwork. And I said, I'm sorry, this just doesn't work. And he went, he ate it. He wound up losing money because he went and did it someplace else, and basically told me after the first issue that he just couldn't afford to do this in the future. But by putting the first issue out, I was now had a ticket to the underground press within the San Francisco area. Oh. And most especially, I met Ron Turner of Last Gasp Echo Funnies. And Ron was the one who then connected me to all of the production resources that I needed to go forward. I needed a pre-print photo house to put the logos on the artwork and put the type on the covers. And I needed a printer, and he recommended both of those, and I wound up working with him for the rest of the time that I had the company.
Wow. Because I've always found out.
The other key production aspect was the unsung hero of Star Reach is Tom Warzikowski, who lettered half the material. And if I needed something done and I was running into a deadline problem, Tom would figure out how to squeeze it in and get it done. And he did a ton of work for me that helped me out immensely.
So how did it feel to, you come from a pure creative aspect. Suddenly you are not only creative, but you are an accountant. You are everything. You're booking the numbers. You got to see how many you can print, how many you can sell. And how were you able to cope with that? Was that something that you were able to manage, or was that something that you realized quite quickly? You were like, oh my God, this is a nightmare.
No, I took to it like right away. I really had more fun being on the executive side of things than I did being on the creative side of things. That it was the right thing to do at the time to enable other artists to come and other writers to come up with their material. As a writer, I was kind of fixated on the Marvel superheroes, the DC superheroes, which were aimed at that time at teenagers. And creatively, I had a hard time thinking about material that would be of interest to young adults. But once Star Reach got started, people came to me. I got a lot of stuff in the mail and published a good amount of it. John Workman, of course, showed up in the mail and wound up having a major career at Heavy Metal magazine for years. Gene Day who wound up at Marvel, got his start at Star Reach. I'm blanking out his name. I fielded a call from an editor who was like, looking, how do I contact this guy? And I was happy to give him an intro. Off he went. But I enjoyed the creative, the aspect of the executive administrative aspect of it. I was reinventing the wheel in certain sense because I didn't have a lot of people to look to for that kind of detail. And so, of course, I made a lot of mistakes, and I learned from my mistakes until they became fatal. And eventually I killed my company. because I didn't know what I was doing. But I had fun doing it anyway.
Yeah.
Wow. Go ahead, Steve.
So after you've after, as you said, Star Reach has to go away. What were you left with then? What was going through your mind? Were you thinking, okay, I want to continue doing this type of thing, or I'm going to jump back into creative?
Well, no, I was actually what would be the most interesting thing I could do to make money. And what was happening at the time was that Marvel was setting up, was figuring out that the comic shops were where they were getting their strongest growth, while their newsstand sales were continuing to collapse.
Mm.
And they were looking to hire somebody to help handle that. And long story made short, they hired me. It took that I just described 9 months in 2 sentences. but I wound up going back to work for Marvel as a marketing executive. I set up their direct sales department, and ran around the country for 2 years to pay off my printing bill. I mean, the reason I needed it was I didn't want to. My brother was my accountant, and he was saying, you should declare bankruptcy. And I said, no, I promised this guy I'd pay him. And so I lived cheap, and every month I wrote a check to the printer. And after 2 years, I paid it off.
Wow.
But by then I'd fallen in love and was moving, and my partner was in California, and I needed to come home. So I loved working in Marvel's sales department. It was a lot of fun. I enjoyed the people and the executives. I enjoyed working with the editors to the degree that I did. And if Marvel had been located in San Francisco, I would have stayed. But I had to come home.
Now you got to experience Marvel during like some creative years, and then there's a gap there, and then you go back. Can you explain what the differences were? Like how did it change so much? Like how did the business change?
Well, I was focused on the marketing and sales side of things in my executive position. I wasn't involved in the creative work at all. I mean, that was the editorial department. And,
Right.
I got to know Danny Fingeroth quite a bit at the time, because in order to sell the books, I had to promote them. In order to promote them, I needed to know what was in them. And so Danny went around and collected all the information as to what was going to be in the comics the month that we were promoting. And we would sit down and he'd go over all that stuff with me and write it up, and then I'd get it out into the market. And occasionally that would mean, going to the editor and asking for a piece of artwork that we could use to promote the material.
Did you have to work hand in hand sometimes with Jim Shooter?
I say that again.
Did you have to work sometimes hand in hand with Jim Shooter?
Oh, yes. I mean, he and I were at the same level as far as the org chart was concerned. So and anything I did with editorial was through Jim.
Yes, because I remember at that time, Jim Shooter was trying to, basically grab Marvel by the collar and like stretch it up and try and make things more professional and efficient. So I think that goes hand in hand with your task of trying to move away from, newsstands and being involved with comic shops. I would have definitely thought you two guys would have been definitely hashing some stuff out.
Yes, we were on the same page as far as what kind of future we wanted Marvel to have as far as content was concerned. He was as sensitive. He was talking to as many retailers and distributors as I was. We differed in how to approach things. I mean, we butted heads a lot. but I always respected his organizational talent a lot. And one of the ways was, as I described, I needed to know what was in the comics 3 months before they happened. And Marvel had gotten so inefficient that they were putting books out 3 weeks before they were printed. I mean, so it was impossible to sell something without knowing what was in it. And so Jim understood that right away, and worked very hard to get more further ahead in the comics, in the creative cycle, so that we would be able to promote everything that they were putting out. And we also were able to cooperate a lot on focusing major hits. I mean, we did a lot with Frank Miller on Daredevil. Dennis Cowan came along. I don't remember what strip he was working on, but we identified Dennis as the next big thing, and Jim had a big hand in that.
Wow. Good now.
All right. I'm going to take it back now to DC. All right.
Wow.
I got to go there. So I remember when I was a young kid, I was looking in a case and there was a Batman 200. And I was like, should I get that? And the owner of the comic shop looks at me and goes, well, you got to look at investments or things you may want. Do you think it'll be worth something? Blah, blah. And I was like, you know what? It's Batman 200. The cover looks great. I'm going to get it. What was it like, and what was your hand Batman?
You cut in and out, so you'll need to ask the question again.
What like to work on the Batman 200 issue?
Oh, yes. Okay. So I told you the story of how I got to New York in the first place. Once I meet Julie Schwartz in person, the first thing he assigns me to do is Batman 200.
Wow.
Because it's this important issue. We thought the fans would enjoy a kind of retrospective. So we had to bring back a 1940s villain, the Scarecrow, and he's continuing to teach me how to be a writer. I mean, I needed a lot of training, and he walked me through that, writing that script. I probably did 2 or 3 drafts before he accepted it. Then the next thing he gives me is working with this new artist named Neil Adams to do the Spectre. And I think I'm the one that came up with the idea of bringing back the Wildcat, which I don't think it appeared anywhere else. I may be mistaken. There may have been some version of it in one of the Justice Leagues, but I don't remember. And that wound up being the first story that wound up being in print. So I have Neil Adams to be my first story in print, and all goes downhill from there.
Wow.
That's a great cover too. That he
no
did.
pressure, huh, Mike? No pressure.
That's actually astonishing to learn.
Yeah.
God.
You get there, and you would imagine that if you're brand new, they would shuttle you off and maybe give you a little 4-page story in House of Secrets. But Batman 200, that's amazing. I mean,
well, again, remember, Julie Schwartz is in real desperate need of a writer, because he'd been working with a buddy named John Broome for decades at that point, and John was phasing out, living in Paris, and getting out of comics, and the field is slowly shrinking. It's dying. Everybody is in their 40s and 50s and 60s. I was the youngest person in the office by 20 years. Wow. I'm completely untrained. I'm 18 years old. I have no etiquette training, nothing. I'm walking around in t-shirts and shorts, and everybody else is wearing ties and jackets. And I mean, a year later, things had started to shift. There were a lot more of us, and we became a cohort. But I mean, Neil was an old guy to me. He's like 25, and I'm 18, and he's married and got a couple of kids, and he seems very old to me at that point. But he was the young Turk kid as far as DC was concerned.
Wow. Now, Mike.
Yeah, so it was not surprising that I got the assignments in retrospect. What was helpful was that I was able to keep learning, and I learned quickly how to do things. And so just seeing how Neil drew the story taught me immensely. And the story I wrote after that was a Green Lantern that Gil Kane drew.
Wow.
Where I brought back the Golden Age Green Lantern, who had appeared previously. And I knew how Gil Kane drew, and so I knew how to write panels that Gil would excel at.
Wow.
And that story comes across really well. I was quite proud of that one.
Wow.
Yeah.
Mike, I want to ask you, compare Julie and Stan. You got them on like those. How would you compare those two?
Well, all right. That's an easy answer because I never worked with Stan. I worked with Roy.
Right, but you never talked with Stan. You never, because he was there.
I had one or two conversations with him, and they were more social than. And I was one of the writers that Roy was working with. Stan and I never had an editorial conversation.
Oh, okay, good to know.
But to answer your question about Roy is to answer the question about the difference between Marvel and DC. DC had traditional attitude towards magazines, and that the editors were in charge. And so Julie was very hands-on and wanted things to be done in a particular way. Roy was the exact opposite. Roy said, it's sink or swim. You either do the work and we like it and you keep doing it, or you do the work and we don't like it and we find somebody else to do it. He was very upfront about that.
Yeah. Steve Englehart said the same thing.
Yeah.
and fortunately, I was able to swim for 4 or 5 years there before I drowned.
You know what though? That brought out the best in you guys. Like if you think about that, you guys are just trying to produce a good story, and you had that freedom to do it. That's why you guys created such crazy, unbelievable stuff without so obviously a little bit of structure, but not much. And if you think about that, how Marvel started, those characters started getting, bigger and bigger. I mean, it's because of writers like you.
Well, and the structure, the creative structure was also better than DC's from my view, in that the writing and the artwork was much more tied together working at Marvel than where they were completely separated at DC. If I'm writing a Green Lantern for Gil Kane, I'm unique. A writer normally just wrote a script for Green Lantern and it didn't matter who drew it, as far as the writer was concerned. And as far as the editor was concerned, the editor wasn't thinking of the artist. Where at Marvel was the other way around. The artist came first, the writer came second. The writer came up with a storyline, but the artist interpreted it and pasted it visually in a way that was much more dramatic and much more interesting. And so the good writers like Steve and Roy would inspire an artist to come up with, interesting conflicts and stuff like that. And then it comes back to us to actually then dialogue. And we know we get to play off of the body language and the facial expressions of the characters that the artists have drawn. And so that makes our writing better.
Yeah.
And more integrated. So again, I enjoyed working that way at Marvel. It was also faster and I made more money.
Wow.
Well,
Go ahead, Steve.
that's a fascinating insight because
Yes, that's awesome.
for many years there's been reams of debate as to what the difference between Marvel and DC was, and why Marvel was seen as this dynamic, explosive, creative force, while DC was this massive block of nothing that wasn't moving. You only had you had Neil, of course, who was getting in there and getting it done. Of course, Gil, but generally speaking, if you were able to grind your way through one of those monotonous issues of World's Finest, and then you were to read an issue of the Kree Skrull War, on the Avengers, you're in. I mean, why on earth? You're going to drop that DC book because you're going to want to pick up another Marvel. So that little gem of information that you just dropped right there, it's very telling. And I think a lot of people who are watching this or who are going to watch this are going to be like, "Oh my word, there it is."
And so another way to look at this is to compare art to art. Is that look at how Neil drew his stories at DC, and then look at how he drew them at Marvel. And you put them side by side. The stuff at DC is great because he is interpreting scripts and bringing out the best that's in them. But the work at Marvel is even better because he's there at the beginning creating it for himself.
Yeah. And Steve and Mike and Niles, I'll tell you this though, that's just a testament of Roy knowing comics. He knew comic books and he knew what worked. Obviously he adapted what Stan Lee did, but then he knew how to interpret the writer, the artist and stuff, and making that, because that, when Roy was editor-in-chief, just the characters and stuff that came out of that is just unprecedented. I mean, it was the best, I think some of the best stories and definitely the best characters since Stan and Jack. And I don't think that's ever been equaled. But it's just funny how Roy, in his simplistic way, because when I would ask Roy these things, he's like, "Well, yeah, I just had him write it." It's always just so matter of fact with him. But you see how it really worked. And that's the difference where, Julie is kind of an old timer. Roy is a new timer, and he understands the business and he understands the medium because he was a fan of that. And then that's how Roy revolutionized. I'm getting goosebumps, Mike, because nobody's ever said it from that way, the way you presented it to us. So that's fantastic. Awesome. Go ahead, Steve. I got it. I'm itchy.
So to bring it a full 360, after you had finished working in Marvel's marketing department and moved back to California, what did you do then?
Well, I just sort of followed my impulse. I did some consulting for Pacific Comics for 3 months in hopes that would become a long-term position. But while we had a good time working with each other, they really couldn't afford me. And I needed a little bit more autonomy than they were prepared to give. So we had a conversation on a Tuesday that I'm not going to be on staff at Pacific, but I'm going to do some packaging for them of the Michael Moorcock material that I had rights to. On Friday, I leave San Diego. I drive to Los Angeles. I meet with Mark Evanier, and I say, "I'm an agent." I just made it up. I said, "I'm an agent." And he said, "Well, I've got a new strip." And it was called The DN Agents. And I was able to sell that like right away to Eclipse. And I met with Steve Gerber, and Steve had an idea, and I had 3 or 4 companies bidding for it. And I told Steve, the best one is Marvel. And he said, "Marvel, I sued them." And I said, yes, but that lawsuit's over. You're done with that. Let's move on. And sure enough, I mean, Archie Goodwin was totally happy to buy the material. So in the space of a week, I have 2 properties that I'm able to sell within 6 weeks. I have the Moorcock material. And so I became an agent. And that wound up being the thing that I did the most in comics. I ran an agency for 20 years.
Oh, wow.
I represented Tim Sale when he was doing Batman. I represented Norm Brayfogle when he was doing Batman. So both of those were signature Batman artists at the time. I worked a lot with Dark Horse. I have a long-term friendship with Paul Chadwick, so I represented Concrete at Dark Horse. He's just finishing his a brand new series just now. He's within a couple of months of getting it done. Just got to do some coloring work. And I did 50 or 60 artists over a 20-year period. Those are the highlights that leap to mind.
What? So I got to watch my back. I might have Mike Friedrich breathing down my neck now. Oh, taking over. Uh-oh. Now, uh-oh. Wow, that's awesome. I never knew that you did that, Mike. That's so cool. Go ahead now.
Well, I kept my finger in other ways. I wound up founding the WonderCon convention with a couple of partners and did that for 15 years every year before we sold it to the Comic-Con. All along I did publishing consulting and marketing consulting. I remember one of the best stories I had is I just remember was somebody from Detroit called me and said, this artist friend of mine says I should get into publishing. And I knew the artist distantly. I didn't know him. He wasn't a friend. And the guy that's calling me up, I'd never met at all. And I said, well, I charge $1,000 a day. He's okay, fine. So we had this 3-hour conversation on the phone where I told him all the things he needed to learn about publishing and all the things he needed to address. And he complimented me more than anybody else by saying, this $1,000 is the best $1,000 I've ever spent because you convinced me not to do it.
What? Mike, I gotta admit, like, what a way to be an agent too, because you have all that experience behind you too. Like, you were a writer, you're like sales, you knew the business inside and out by then. So you repping somebody that can trust you and somebody that understands that's amazing. I never knew that you did that. It's just saying, like, what great experience to have to start doing that, and you just winged it on Mike Evania. Okay, now go ahead. Wow.
Well, hey, when you know your industry, the best thing to do, if you want to grow, is become a consultant or something of that nature. So, I mean, that's what I do now. It works out great. But so you mentioned it, but WonderCon, then you get into the realm of doing conventions, a very popular convention, by the way, for 15 years before you sold it to Comic-Con. What even made you say, let me get involved with actually hosting the conventions now?
Okay, well, again, it's something I sort of walked backwards into. I had the idea of doing trade shows for retailers, where the distributors, there were a lot of competitive distributors back at that time. This is the early 80s, where the distributors and the publishers would buy exhibit booths to market their material to the retail community. And I did that for about 2 years, and some retail friends of mine in the Bay Area said, well, we want to do one here. And I don't remember, there's a chicken and egg question, but at some point the trade shows were just not working. And so I told them, well, I can't get enough exhibitors. And so a buddy of mine named John Barrett, who ran a comic store at the time, he's now passed away, said, well, why don't we do a convention to attract all the publishers so that they'll then come and exhibit at the trade show. So we wound up doing the trade show. It flopped, but the convention stuck. And 7 guys started it. By year 2, it was down to 4, and the 4 of us stayed with it for about 10 more years, and then dwindled down to 2, and then Joe Field and I finished it up. But my role was completely back end. I did hotel relations. I got all the vendors together for who sold the tickets and who did the publicity and did the marketing, and I handled the money. So I did all that stuff, and we had one guy handling all the panels and the talent, and we had another guy handling the dealer's room, and we had another guy handling the PR. And it was a very stable group. We would have dinner every month for 6 months ahead of the show, and we had a great time.
Is that where you were organizing it? Was that at the Moscone Center?
No, it went to the Moscone Center after we sold it. We were working at the Oakland Convention Center.
Ah, okay.
Wow.
The last couple of WonderCons that we did in the Moscone Center, I remember setting up there for WonderCon. And by the way,
I did
one of the best shows in the world.
I did come out from behind the curtain at the last show. We had made the deal to sell it. So we announced the sale, and the show starts on Friday. The Monday before the show, Michael Chabon wins the Pulitzer Prize for The Further Adventures of Cavalier and Clay. And so I interviewed Michael Chabon on Friday at his first public appearance, having won the Pulitzer Prize.
Nice.
Wow.
So that was really enjoyable.
Yeah. The funny thing is that when the show moved away from San Francisco, it has never been the same.
I agree.
The San Francisco show was something amazing. I have never seen such hardcore back issue purchasers and such knowledgeable comic people in San Francisco. It was incredible. And then when they moved the show, it was like, ooh, okay.
Well, and the same was true for the talent, because the show was small enough that the artists and the writers could actually meet and talk with the fans, where the bigger shows were much more impersonal. And so it was right in a happy medium. It was big enough to attract the dealers that you're describing, but small enough that the talent could meet the fans on a more personal basis. Yeah, we kind of hit the sweet spot. We had a good time.
Yes.
Well, you see how many conventions are going on today. How is today changed from when your heyday? How do you think?
Here I get to plead total ignorance. I've been out of the field for 20 years, so I have no idea what the current convention scene is at all.
Well,
I was brought back to San Diego 3 or 4 years ago to get an award, and I was just overwhelmed by what I saw there. I mean, there were 20 different conventions going on simultaneously, it seemed like. There wasn't one show, there were 20 shows under the same roof.
Yeah.
That's incredible. I mean, just Mike, you're like a Swiss Army knife of just so much stuff. It's really impressive. I didn't know like, who would you think that the guy that's putting on WonderCon wrote Batman 200? You know, I had a hand in Thanos too. Like, I mean, like, that's crazy. I mean, the promoters I got to deal with, my God, you just want to push them off a cliff. They don't got none of that stuff in their back pocket. My God, Mike, I got to tell you, I'm very impressed. I didn't know that you went into that direction. So after you sell off WonderCon, where do you go from there? Where does Mike go from there?
Well, by that point, I had gotten too old to be an agent because I was now no longer of the generation of the people I was representing. And so the younger artists didn't really know who I was. And I wound up spending 2 horrible years looking for work. After 30 years of just falling into things that worked out fine, I run up against a wall, and after a couple of years, I've described it. I went into a wormhole, and I came out becoming a union rep at the University of California. So I represented research scientists and research technicians at UC. We were the 3rd largest union on campus. So I did that for 10 years before I retired.
Wow. Crazy. What a life. All right. Now, we're going to, I know we've kept you for a long time. We're going to wrap it up, but we got some last questions. Now, you got some last stuff to ask Mr. Friedrich?
No, well, I just want to, say thank you, especially with going off and being a rebel and getting your own publication out there. It's inspired so many of us that are still doing it today, using modern, Kickstarter and Indiegogos and things, and just pushing our own creative outlet. So I really appreciate you taking that step to inspire, other generations that led to my generation, and then we hope to inspire others. So I really appreciate what you did. And, have you ever thought of ever publishing something again on your own?
Yes, and the answer is no. Because again, I don't know the market enough to be able to know what to do with it.
Yeah.
With anything.
Wow, that's incredible. Go ahead, Steve.
I would just like to say thank you for coming on. The wealth of information, firsthand information that you have revealed here is exactly what this podcast is about. Yes, there's entertainment and there's fun, but there's also education. The firsthand information that you're giving out when someone watches this show, they may have heard some stuff. Now they're going to be able to go, oh, so this leads to that and this leads to this. Oh, I didn't know that he was involved in this. So anyone that is going to be doing any research, you never know, someone who's watching this podcast could end up to be doing some ridiculous documentary or some huge book. And, they're going to have to contact you in regards to certain things now because now we are aware. So I would, I want to thank you personally for coming on the show and giving this firsthand information to us today.
Well, yeah. All right. So if people want to do research into Star Reach, my archives have gone to the University of Columbia Library. So you want to look up my how I kept my royalty reports and what kind of records I kept. They've got it all now.
Wow, and Mike, I gotta admit, like, you were kind of a pioneer, even though maybe you didn't right at the beginning, but you were right there when a lot of these things were just kind of starting, and you were like part of a lot of different things that you excelled at. But like, I find your career amazing because talking to a lot of creators, they just stay in one avenue and there we go. And if it doesn't work out, they don't really go anywhere else. But you kind of branched out in so many different layers of the business. I just find it fascinating, and you excelled, like I said, and there wasn't many other people doing that at that time. And like I said, I'm going to go back to, you wrote Iron Man 55. You got that in your back pocket. And it's like you can always play that as a trump card. Yeah, you can be like, yeah, whatever. I got this though. But I mean, it's just really amazing. So you left your fingerprint, not just on comic writing, but also like in all these other avenues. I commend you, sir, because that is, I'm actually blown away, and I think it's fascinating, and I'm honored more so that you're here and that you're telling your story. And just like Steve said, I love presenting to the masses that there are these other guys out there that you might not have heard of, or you might have heard them in the winds, and they've done such great things for the industry. I mean, Mike, it's an honor. I'm gonna yell at Roy because I didn't know you had so much more to offer. All he said, yeah, he's a great guy. I didn't know he was an agent. That's so incredible. So, Mike, I thank you for being here, and it is an absolute honor. We'll definitely want to have you again. And you know, you can teach me a thing or two now too. I mean, that's incredible. So I thank you for being here. It's really an honor.
Well, glad to be here.
Yeah. Okay, everybody. Yeah, there it is. Mike Friedrich. Steve, want to get us out of here? Unbelievable, Mike.
Great show. Boom.
Oh.
Hey everyone, thank you for joining us on Pop XP. If you haven't already, make sure to click that subscribe button and also click the bell for notifications when we go live and we upload some awesome new content. Also, don't forget to head on over to Twitter and follow us at the Pop XP and over on Instagram at the Pop XP. Thanks again everyone, and we'll see you soon.